as a non-smoker. I don't like, perhaps I don't spend lots of times in pub gardens, but equally I don't like the smell of cigarette smoke. And I think if we want to keep people healthy, we are going to have to make doing something very unhealthy, which does affect other people, I think, more difficult. And I'm afraid I think that there's going to be an awful lot of people saying this is going to affect hospitality and everything else. And I think we have heard those arguments before, and I think with appropriate transition, other discussions. But I think ultimately this is the right thing to do.
We're going to turn our attention now to a story on the front page of the Times this morning about health MOTs for the over 40s coming to a workplace near you. The idea being to kind of be a preventative measure, maybe identify particularly heart attack and risk of heart attack before it comes along. Nikki, do you think this is a good idea in the workplace, or do you think actually it can be a little bit intrusive?
No, I think it's a really good idea, and it's interesting. I was here listening to you, Chloe, saying that you hadn't been offered an MOT, and by the sounds of it, and lots of listeners haven't. I was offered, and since I got a text message from my GP surgery, and I thought, well, okay, fair enough, interesting. I'll call them, and that's the first thing, which is actually getting through to the GP. And then they said, yeah, we do it. I think it was one Wednesday afternoon a month. And so, I couldn't even book the appointment. So I think actually going to people's workplaces, of course, if it's done in an appropriate, confidential way, and it's not compulsory, although hopefully a bit of peer pressure if everyone else is doing it, I think is a very good thing. The challenge obviously will be follow up if something is identified. Obviously, something critical I think would be followed up. But if it was something where it's like lifestyle, then actually really making sure that people do get the appropriate support. So if they are told to go to your GP, that actually, as per the discussions we've had before, they can actually get in there. But I mean, I think that just tying the previous conversation, if this is part of a strategy about preventative healthcare, which I think is absolutely right, given the aging population and everything else, I think the government should make a lot more of it. If West Streeting has persuaded the Treasury to invest in preventative healthcare to save money later on, that is actually quite a step forward, and something that really should be, this should be this is what we're going to do. And we're going to try and tackle health problems before they arise, before they get serious, in many different ways. I think that is a very good strategy.
I guess the big issue here, Jack, exactly as Nikki just says there, is about support. Because if you speak to people who are, for example, let's say obese, they don't need to be told they're overweight. Most people will know that. Most people will know that they should do something about it. It will improve their quality of life, probably improve the length of their life. It's about knowing how to do it. And also not just even knowing, because a lot of people know what they need to do. It's finding the motivation and the self-control to be able, and fitting into a busy life, to be able to actually do something about it. And that's the real challenge.
And sometimes that motivation and self-control only comes from being really pushed. And so, I mean, I think this is a great idea, but it should only be one part of the picture. I think I would avert much more of the health service resource to preventative work. I think in the long term it would really pay off. And I think going into workplaces, social spaces, would be a massive step forward. I agree with Nikki about the and yourselves about the whole business of people supposedly having been offered these checks. Until very recently, I certainly wasn't offered one in Scotland, despite the fact that I had understood that at one time they had existed. On a recent visit to my GP surgery, I was told there is actually a well-manned clinic right next door, which I hadn't even realised was there. So I think sometimes even if the GP service does have this facility, they don't remember to mention it. They don't keep records of who has been, and they don't follow it through. And I think having these alternative locations is really worthwhile. But I also think it needs to be tied into other services. A service like this, I would tie into, for example, local leisure and recreation services run by the local authority. Because what most people need is just a bit of exercise.
Yeah.
Sometimes a health check can show you things that yes, they can deal with. They can be helped by your diet. They can be helped by maybe some kind of medical treatment, but they can also be helped with by by exercise, and a direct link into, which I know certainly was happening in Glasgow at one point, a direct link into local leisure centres and fitness centres is sometimes would be a much better diagnosis than some medication or referral of that sort. So I'm very much in favour of this. I think there should be much more of it. I think we should be willing to sacrifice some of the money that's spent on health treatments to invest much more in this long-term health prevention.
Well, so on the preventative model, this is something that Sir Keir Starmer's been talking about, excuse me, in the context of banning smoking in pub gardens, which he says would relieve the burden on the NHS. This was first kind of bubbling around in the Sun yesterday, but he's doubled down on it, saying it would cut the burden on the NHS. This preventative model, it means taking action in relation to preventable deaths, which he points to 80,000 of those in relation to smoking. I'm just keen to get both of your thoughts on this. Nikki, let's start with you. On there's a kind of odd dilemma, I think, for some people here, where it's, should they have the freedom to do something that blatantly causes a lot of harm and a lot of stress on somebody's own body and potentially on other people's, and on the kind of state of the NHS, but actually should a government intervention be able to trump that liberty to make that decision?
Well, I think I'm probably right in the middle of that conflict, and I think you're right, Callum, which I think a lot of people are, which is, on the one hand, I'm slightly uncomfortable about sort of, banning things and all of that. But I have to say, I think if we as a country are serious about preventative health strategies, this is something that exactly, I was going to point to that 80,000 figure. People die of smoking-related diseases every year, and the cost to the NHS. And actually, as a non-smoker, I don't like, perhaps I don't spend lots of time in pub gardens, but equally, I don't like the smell of cigarette smoke. And I think if we want to keep people healthy, we are going to have to make doing something very unhealthy, which does affect other people, I think, more difficult. And I'm afraid I think that there's going to be an awful lot of people saying this is going to affect hospitality and everything else. And I think we have heard those arguments before, and I think with appropriate transition, other discussions. But I think ultimately this is the right thing to do. But yeah, of course, it makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, it is a tricky one. I saw lots of takes yesterday, sort of talking about the triumph that is a smoking area, a club, and how people get to spend time chatting there and having a lovely time.
I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah.
So you can smoke in a club?
Outside the club, sorry.
Right,
outside the club. So there's like a designated bit. It tends to be just beside the main queue. And I just tend to think, sorry, if you're running a hospitality or kind of, place like that, and the best thing people can say about it is the smoking area is the highlight, I think you just need to up
Which
your
is
game.
outside.
Yeah, exactly. It's ridiculous. Jack, smoking bans, something of which you have experience. You brought in the smoking ban in public places in Scotland, leading the way, actually, in the UK. So what about this as an evolution of that?
Well, I was a real skeptic in 2003 when we started our consultation on grounds of liberty and feasibility. I was really not convinced at all that a ban on smoking in public places, indoor public places, would be feasible. I was persuaded in the course of 12 months.
Oh, have we lost Jack? I think we've lost Jack. He appears to have frozen. There was us talking about the wonder that is the connection to Manila. We'll get Jack McConnell back, because his insight on this, I think, will be really interesting. Partly because of the difficulty in winning people over, I think, is the thing, in convincing people, and the need for clarity, I suppose, in these sorts of bits of legislation, because it is slightly murky, isn't it, Nikki? Can I stand in a doorway outside? Do I have to move 100 yards down the road into some sort of more different open space? I just can't be outside the pub. That is a slightly grey area, I think, at this point, which is clearly very early in the conversation, but a grey area nonetheless.
Yeah, it is. It sounds like it is a grey area. It sounds like, yeah, exactly. Is it going to be sort of, fixed spaces like pub gardens with very clear boundaries that you can't smoke in, but you can still smoke if you're walking down the street or walking in a park or wherever. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of debate. I mean, I think you can see that, and some people are worrying that this is sort of a continuation of a slippery slope. And you start with indoor bans, and you have, outdoor in certain areas, they have generally outdoor. And I think there was a suggestion, wasn't there a story earlier this week about somewhere in California that was now thinking about banning people smoking in their own homes?
Yeah.
And I think that again, that I can see there'll be people who will say, where are we headed with all of this? But equally, the legislation was we were going to stop younger people buying cigarettes at all.
Yeah, exactly. So
and I also just wonder, Nikki, how many people this actually affects, because we're being told that young people don't start smoking now. We spoke to so many head teachers and they say, no, they don't smoke. I mean, one head teacher said to us a few months ago, hadn't caught anyone in years smoking at school. They're all vaping, which obviously in itself is a problem for young people. But the government has, over many years, encouraged smokers to turn to vaping, many of whom have. So I just wonder, I don't know what the figures are, but I feel like it's quite a small percentage of people that would be impacted by this, because it's people who smoke and then go to the pub. Vaping would still be allowed, for example, in a pub garden.
Yeah, it would. I mean, I think there's a whole debate to be had, and I'm not an expert in vaping and the dangers of that and what that does. I think, it was obviously particularly, I think, introduced to help people who were smoking cigarettes to perhaps do something that is slightly harmful to them. The challenge has been that younger people have particularly picked up on vaping and have become potentially addicted to that when they weren't smoking cigarettes in the first place. I mean, look, I think this is going to be an ongoing debate, and I think the way you framed at the beginning, Callum, which is a kind of actually, should we have the freedom? People know it's people know it's harmful.
Yeah.
If you buy a packet of cigarettes these days, the photos on them are horrific, and yet people obviously still some people choose to do it. But it's a good question, Chloe, about how many people are actually going to be caught by this.
I think that's the thing. Smoking is never a good choice. It just isn't. No. And so actually, why should you have freedom to just make a bad choice? That's ridiculous, isn't it? Especially when it actually does have a huge societal knock-on effect. And the other part of this, would any of us choose to go back to the place where, while you're having your steak and chips in the pub on a Friday night, smoke is swirling from the tables around you? I don't think anyone would choose that.
I remember explaining to my kids once that when you used to go clubbing, you used to come home and you would just stink of cigarettes, even though you hadn't been smoking.
Vile.
And it's just like, because it was just so smoky. Interesting here, Mick has got in touch saying, only last night I asked a friend who runs a hotel what he thought of banning smoking outside the hotel. He said he'd already done it after seeing a family of 4 having lunch, being covered in smoke by 2 lads just having a beer. A £400 bill versus a tenner.
Wow. Yeah, fair enough. That's an interesting one, actually. Really, really interesting. We're struggling to get back to Jack McConnell, frustratingly, but what we'll try to do is hear his thoughts at some point, because he led a smoking ban, and I think that is the crucial insight there.